Hello, students. Here we are. The video lecture for Chapter 10, Obscenity and Indecency, Social Norms and Legal Standards, JMS 494. First up, before I get into the material from the textbook, I just want to start off with this. There was, in 2020, Netflix released this French film known in English as Cuties. It is about, and I'm looking at some note here, an 11-year-old Senegalese immigrant who joins a dance group. The movie was intended to criticize the hypersexualization of young girls. Got a lot of attention at Sundance Film Festival, but then it got a lot of criticism. People thought the criticism of hypersexualization was in fact showing very sexualized dance moves from these young girls. I haven't seen the movie. I'm just going to admit I haven't seen the movie, but the movie has come under a lot of attack, a lot of criticism. As of this recording, there's still a court case going on in Texas where Texas is claiming that it basically amounts to child pornography. And the court case is still going on. I don't know what's going to happen. But when it comes to, as we go through this lecture, you'll see children are often at the focus of many of these cases, okay? Material that depicts children in a sexualized manner can get you in very, very deep trouble, as it probably should. And then also material is often vetted as to what is acceptable for children. So even what adults see is often limited by what would be acceptable to show to a child. So children and children's perceptions and children's standards and the effects of children are central to many of the issues we'll be talking about. And Netflix has known about this, they've known about this controversy. I think they were not expecting it. And there's also reports that I think the film was pulled. I think right now you can't find the film on Netflix, but for a while it was still on Netflix, but they manipulated the algorithm so that it wouldn't come up so much. It wouldn't be recommended, for example. Anyway, I just bring that up. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. I think some members of my own family, my brother and my parents even canceled Netflix, believing that this was child pornography. I haven't seen it. I'm going to believe it was a work of art. I'm just going to believe it was a work of art that happened to show some images that offended some people. That's what I'm going to say. I don't think it's probably child pornography. One other thing, before I get into the textbook material, the ratings that are put on films, G, PG, PG-13, y'all know this stuff. Those are not mandated by the government, and there are no standards imposed by the government. This is something that the film industry does to itself, and every form of media, or at least most media industries, do this to themselves to claim that, hey, we are regulating ourselves, we are cleaning up our act, we're making sure kids aren't exposed to nasty material. So, Mr. Government Man, you don't need to come in. We are taking care of the business. You understand? So the media industries police themselves to say we're taking care of our business to prevent the government from coming in and regulating them and imposing explicit forms of censorship. With the motion picture industry, these are the current standards that we have. NC-17 is adult. There used to be a term, triple X. When I was growing up, films were advertised as triple X films. There was never any real definition of triple X. That was just something the industry made up to say, hey, it's really, really nasty. You're going to see absolutely everything. So triple X used to be the term, or X-rated, and now NC-17 is something that's restricted for people 17 and over. And there's a great documentary about film ratings called This Film Is Not Yet Rated that shows the incredible subjectivity. You can show extreme violence and still get a PG or a PG-13. You show male nudity, you're automatically going to get an R. Front male nudity, front female nudity, maybe PG-13. So it's really subjective. Great documentary. This Film Is Not Yet Rated. Okay, here, let me move myself so you can get a good shot of the David. Okay, here are some key terms, okay? Here's some key terms. The word pornography is not legally precise. It's not legally precise because pornography is in the eye of the beholder. There's a famous saying from a judge, I know it when I see it. There's artistic nudes, maybe an image of a woman breastfeeding, for example. it's hard to, when does something become, when does showing a woman's breast become pornography, and when is it just part of a work of art? And then here you have this famous statue, the David. So pornography is not a precise term. Indecency has a very, very narrow meaning, and it refers specifically to material expressions and images that are inappropriate for children on broadcast radio and TV. Okay. Again, children are the defining standard here. Material that's unacceptable for children on broadcast radio and TV. Broadcast radio and TV is distinct from cable, as we discussed in a previous lecture. And then obscenity, until the mid 20th century, American courts used a broad definition of obscenity, which was allowed to ban a wide variety of materials. Now obscenity has a much more precise and limited definition. Okay, the history stuff. First, we had the Comstock Act, which prohibited, it was named for a man, Anthony Comstock, who launched an anti-obscenity movement in the 1870s. It prohibited the mailing of obscene, lewd, or lascivious material. It was initially concerned with matters of contraception and abortion, okay? The law was amended later to include pornographic material, but originally it was do not spread information about contraception or abortion, right? Because I guess that was considered unacceptable. Comstock was a postal inspector for many, many years and rigidly enforced this law. And we also had the Hicklin rule. According to the rule, adults could be exposed only to material that was acceptable for the most susceptible minds, which was again children. Okay, it was eventually rejected by the courts, but it was in effect in some form or another well into the 1950s. Okay. Current definition, for a while we had the Roth definition, which narrowed the obscenity definition. The Roth definition said an average person, again, what is an average person? Like, what is a reasonable person? But an average person applying contemporary community standards found the work taken as a whole appealed to prurient interests, and it was meant to arouse you, and the material was utterly without redeeming social importance. It was modified many times. It was very, very difficult to apply, and then finally we end up with something called the Miller test. Again, we have an average person. Okay, again we have this statement about contemporary community standards, and it appeals to prurient interests. But now we've got it narrowed it a little bit, okay? The work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct defined by the applicable state law, and this is a big part. This is a big part. The work lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. Okay, instead of just saying it lacks any value, now we've got what kind of things could be qualified as value. Now, again, continuing on the theme of kids and porn, okay, don't take that out of context. We have this concept of variable obscenity, okay. 1957, the US Supreme Court said that government officials may not limit adults to seeing material only suitable for children. And so in 57, the court say you can't limit things. However, material not obscene for adults might be obscene for minors. So restricting minors' access to sexual material is known as variable obscenity. And there are federal and state child pornography laws that might vary a little bit. And child pornography laws are strictly interpreted, as they probably should be. Other considerations. In the privacy of one's home, the First Amendment protects possession of obscene material, except child pornography. In Stanley v. Georgia, it overturned a conviction for possessing obscene films. So in the privacy of your own home, you're allowed to possess this stuff. And the First Amendment protects filmmakers and requires proof that a film is obscene. The government can't just come in and accuse it. They have to prove it in a court, which could be difficult, I suppose. And different laws have been used to control obscenity, including the RICO Act. Was originally designed to combat organized crime. Maybe you've heard that in, crime movies or things like that. Racketeer, influence, corrupt organizations. That's what RICO stands for. Okay, before we talk about indecency, I want to bring this up. Okay, Mae West. I love history. You know how much I love history. Okay, back in 1937, December 1937, Mae West appears on this radio show called the Chase and Sanborn Hour. Okay, Mae West was, she was still in the public consciousness when I was a kid in the 70s. And so I knew who she was, even though she was from decades before. But she was kind of a voluptuous blonde actress, made a lot of movies. And she was known for her sexual innuendos. And, her classic line was, "Why don't you come up and see me sometime?" And the way she would say it with kind of this leer meant that she really didn't, when she said, "Come up and see me," it's like, come inside for a cup of coffee. We're not talking coffee. We're not talking come up and see me. She wants to be with the man. So she appears on this comedy show, Chase and Sanborn Hour. And she appears with the comedian Edgar Bergen, who had a ventriloquist dummy named Charlie McCarthy. The fact that a ventriloquist act was famous on radio still freaks me out. Like, a ventriloquist act on the radio. Think about it. Okay, so Mae West is joking with the dummy, Charlie McCarthy, and says, it's made of wood, presumably, "Come up and I'll let you play in my wood pile." And then there was like an Adam and Eve skit or something like that. And the way she said the lines was very, very sexual, or was implying sexual innuendo. And the FCC was flooded with complaints. People said, "This is outrageous. This is rude." Again, this is 1930s. So people had different standards. And the writers of the show, they claimed the script that we wrote was not indecent. It was the way Mae West said them that made them indecent, right? So I think this is an act of open sexism. The male writers, male producers don't want to be punished, so they pass the blame to the woman, right? Let's blame the woman. And she was very, very famous on film, but her radio career ended. Like, no one is going to put her on the radio anymore, because just the way she says things, even nothing she says is indecent, and there's no openly vulgar words whatsoever. But let's blame Mae West. I love that little story. And then we have an incident which I'm guessing most of y'all are familiar with. If not, let me explain it. In 2004 Super Bowl halftime show, Janet Jackson is performing with Justin Timberlake. At the end of the song, and I think the line was, "I'll have you naked by the end of the song," or something, Justin Timberlake reaches out and pulls off the blouse or the top, whatever Janet Jackson was wearing, exposing one breast for 9/16 of a second. 9/16 of a second, not even a full second, barely more than half a second, 9/16 of a second. And the FCC, just like with the Mae West thing, flooded with complaints. And just like with the Mae West thing, they blamed a woman. The woman gets the blame. The official excuse was this was a wardrobe malfunction. I do not believe it was a wardrobe malfunction. I think the wardrobe functioned exactly as it was intended to function. I think they were intending to shock, I mean, Janet Jackson even had like a metal thing around her nipple. I'm sorry. So like, I think she was planning for that breast to be exposed. But the FCC is flooded with complaints. A fine is put on the individual CBS stations that aired the broadcast. I think it was like $500,000. Eventually it was overturned. Eventually there was no fines whatsoever, because the ruling, which we'll talk about in a few slides, of fleeting images, like there's a fleeting expletive and I guess a fleeting image rule, that if something is so quick, so brief, it doesn't count as really being indecent. So the fines were eventually overturned. Justin Timberlake escaped a lot of criticism and his career wasn't damaged. Janet Jackson, just like with Mae West, Janet Jackson's career was severely harmed by this. And I think people blamed her. Like, why did they blame her? He ripped the thing off. But I think she unfortunately was, unfairly penalized for that. Okay, here's some more information about indecency and fleeting expletives. Okay. At the 2003 Golden Globes Awards, Bono dropped an F-bomb, which will hardly be noticed today. Shortly afterwards, the FCC determined that it was not, acceptable because it was so brief. There was a big court case over it. There was a notable indecency fine in 2015 related to an incident from 3 years before. A TV station in Roanoke, Virginia is doing a story about an adult film star. The adult film star is doing something very good. She's working with the local, I assume it's a woman. I'm sorry, that's maybe sexist of me. Volunteering at a local rescue organization. As part of the story, the news station felt necessary to show a pornographic website in case people don't know what happens on a pornographic website. So they pull up an image from the pornographic website, find the still image that they think is not pornographic, maybe people are wearing clothes or whatever. That's included in the news package, okay? This image from a pornographic website that's not obscene. However, along the sides of the website are some ads that autoplay. I've heard that there's a lot of advertising and pop-up ads on adult websites. So I've heard, right? Okay. So there's this image that's auto-playing. The producer's looking at the main image, not noticing that there's something going on the side. And there was an image of a woman's hand stroking aroused male genitalia. Okay. Let's just phrase it like that. So because that image was shown, even though it was probably on the screen very, very briefly, there was a fine for $325,000. The station got fined $325,000. That's kind of a notable indecency fine. And then we also have something called safe harbor, that the FCC won't punish you for airing indecent material if you're broadcast radio and television now, between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. Kids are not awake after 10 p.m. and they're not awake before 6 a.m. That's the theory, that no child is watching TV after 10 o'clock at night or early in the morning. Therefore, it's okay to air indecent material, which might not be okay earlier in the day. Not obscene material. Again, obscene material is wrong. Indecency refers to material acceptable for children. Okay, other things related to indecency. With the Telecommunications Act of 1996, the FCC or the courts ruled that cable operators may refuse a public access program. If you open a cable franchise in a city, you are obligated to devote a certain portion of programming to what are called PEG channels, public, educational, or government channels. Anyone from the public should have the right to come in and stage their own television show. We call these public access programs. I don't even know if they still exist, but they were a big deal decades ago, public access programs. Cable operators can refuse or could refuse material that they thought was indecent or included nudity, okay? That was an indecency ruling that was embedded in the Telecommunications Act of 1996. However, there was kind of a different perspective when it came to cable channels that were airing sort of adult content late at night. There used to be this policy of even late at night, 11 o'clock at night on a Friday, midnight on a Saturday, whatever, cable channels that had adult content, nudity, right, porn, was scrambled. That meant if you weren't a subscriber, you couldn't see it, or there was some way to unscramble it. You could still see a scrambled image, but you couldn't really see the whole thing. And this content was also limited to only late night transmission. In 1996, with the Telecommunications Act, the court said it's unconstitutional to force signal scrambling, and it's unconstitutional to limit that content only to late at night. The difference between this and public access, right? The first point here, this is public access, and this is that these are channels that people have voluntarily paid for and voluntarily subscribed to. So if I've gone out of my way to pay for HBO, which is not on basic cable, if I've gone out of my way to pay for Cinemax, which is also not part of basic cable, you cannot limit the content or force signal scrambling. So I know that might be a little confusing between this point and the second point. But public access programs, anyone with cable would get that. You can limit indecency, but for channels that people have specifically subscribed to, you cannot limit indecency. I think that's the distinction there. And here's what a scrambled piece of content might look like. You can see some of it. These sort of staticky lines would roll through the picture. So I've heard young, curious teenagers would stare at such images looking barely, like maybe in this little area right here, can I see a breast? Can I see a penis? Can I see something? I've heard people used to stare at screens like that. So I've heard. There is a Simpsons meme for everything. Now, with the age of the internet, there's easier access to sexually explicit content. I mean, it's just a click of a button. And then you have to click something to say, yes, I'm over 18, because no one who's under 18 would ever lie, right? The government has said there's no limits on what consenting adults can see. There's effectively no limits on what consenting adults can see. But the government can take efforts to ban child pornography and to protect minors from obscene material. The communications, I'm going to end right here. The Communications Decency Act of 1996 made it illegal to transmit obscene or indecent messages to recipients under 18. Again, indecency refers to kids and what kids can be exposed to. However, again, these are all so confusing, contradictory things. However, indecent material that's going to adults can't be limited, and the internet is not bound. The overall internet is not bound by the indecency provision because it's not using spectrum. The internet uses wires. I mean, I know it could be wireless in your house, but ultimately the internet relies upon cables to operate, not spectrum. Therefore, the indecency provision for radio and TV does not apply to the internet. You can't transmit the stuff to kids, but it doesn't apply to the internet overall. And the obscene material restriction remains part of federal law. I know a lot of that stuff is confusing. I tried to make it as simple as I could. But anyway, basically just be careful with what, you broadcast, transmit, send out, and especially if it has anything to do with children.